Madam President, we'd like to thank the representative of European civil society, George Samueli, for his sobering report about what's actually happening and what triggered the current conflict, a conflict that's not pitting Ukraine against Russia, but Russia and the West, that is Russia and the US and NATO. We can add to his report something that was uttered yesterday by the Slovakian Prime Minister, Robert Fico. In Europe, we no longer use the word peace. That word doesn't exist. Anyone who speaks of peace is seen as fueling war. Anyone who speaks of war is deemed to be fighting for peace. End of quote. This is the Orwellian reality in which Western states reside in today. They've decided to use the hands of the Kiev regime to inflict strategic defeat on Russia. But their plans are a fiasco. The head of the Kiev junta is concerned. He's concerned that him and his posse are going to be thrown under the bus, to put it simply. He's even blackmailing the world by saying that Ukraine might get a nuclear weapon. This is something we discussed in detail on the 21st of October. Yet our Western colleagues didn't say a word about that. Or sometimes the Kiev junta is getting involved in military escapades, for instance, the one in the Kursk region, where the Ukrainian army suffered losses of over 25,000 people, including its best-trained reserves. There are no effective plans, B, C, or otherwise, which could be used to change the catastrophic situation for the Ukrainian army. Neither Kiev, nor Washington, nor London, nor Brussels have such a plan, nor can they come up with one. It's clear that without the West's direct involvement in the war with a nuclear power, something that the past Ukrainian president ardently wants, the Ukrainian military will continue to retreat and sustain catastrophic losses. This is unequivocally supported by information from the front, where the Russian army is successfully and gradually leading its offensive campaign against key areas. This is something that cannot be denied even by Western military experts. According to their data, in October alone, we liberated 478 square kilometers in October alone. By the end of the month, this was happening at a pace of 30 square kilometers a day. The Russian military, in just the last few days, liberated such large and strategically important settlements such as Gornyak, Selidovo, Katerinovka, Dobrovolya, Bogeyevlenka, Izmailovka, Alexandropol, Shakhterskaya, and Vishnevaya. The counteroffensive that Ukraine led in 2023, and during that campaign, it got just 250 square kilometers, which we've since then liberated. So in 2023, as a whole, it seized 2 times less territory than we've managed to liberate per month. The Kiev authorities are working very hard to hide the truth from their people and their Western sponsors. As we learned yesterday, Ukrainian servicemen were ordered to use in their discussions with journalists the words victory, moving forward, pushing out the enemy, to use those, and not to use the words retreat or the enemy broke through our defenses. On top of that, the propaganda of the Kiev regime in these instances quickly deems cities it's lost as being ones without any strategic importance or heavily subsidized. Examples are Kurakhova, Kurahovskoye, Toretsk, Pokrovsk, and the remainder of the Donbas that remains in the Ukrainian Armed Forces' control. And yet the West continues to supply the Kiev regime with military equipment, including military artillery systems, UAVs, and tanks, including to ensure that Western defense companies can make a quick penny and to use up their outdated or old military equipment. And the Kiev junta is also remembering to line its pockets. The Pentagon recently conducted an audit according to which $2.1 billion sent to Ukraine between January and to December 2022. That's the money that was audited. And it was found out that $1.1 billion were unaccounted for, undocumented. It's unclear how we can check those payments. As for the corruption that goes hand in hand with the deliveries of military equipment to Ukraine is something that journalists will look into later. And yet, already Washington and its allies are realizing that the Zelensky regime's problem lies not in the fact that it doesn't have enough weapons or ammunition. The main reason for the Ukrainian forces falling back on the front is the fact that the people no longer believe the ex-actor, which lost all legitimacy back in May. Zelensky campaigned using slogans about peace with Russia, equal rights for Russian speakers, protecting Orthodox Christianity. That's why people voted for him. However, subsequently, in order to please Western geopolitical interests, he chose the opposite path, turning his country into a pawn in the game against Russia, in the hope that with the US's help, Ukraine can become a queen on the chessboard. This is a treacherous past, treacherous vis-a-vis the Ukrainian people. And so Zelensky sold fertile land and strategic companies to Western corporations for a pittance. This process is ongoing. As we found out from the secret annex to the so-called Zelensky peace plan, Ukraine is ready to provide to the US the use of strategic resources in Ukraine: uranium, titanium, lithium, and graphite. These annexes are probably secret because, according to Article 13 of the Ukrainian Constitution, the Ukrainian subsoil does not belong to the government. It belongs to the people of Ukraine. And giving away these resources to foreign companies would require a referendum as a bare minimum. I'd like to remind you that the US has already been eyeing up these deposits. Senator Lindsey Graham suggested that the US could provide assistance to Kiev in exchange for access to minerals, which he valued at 10 to 12 trillion US dollars. Selling off all of Ukraine's assets is something other sponsors of the Kiev regime are insisting on. A European Council decision on giving out loans against frozen Russian assets. In that document, there's a condition on the transfer to Brussels of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex assets. Recognizing that the current Ukrainian leader is acting in the best traditions of thieves, traitors, and against the people, hetmans, realizing that Ukrainians are turning away from Zelensky en masse. As a result, the Ukrainian army is experiencing a catastrophic lack of servicemen, and there are no more volunteers turning up at the draft offices. In order to solve this problem, the regime is using all sorts of tricks, inventing more and more sophisticated methods to get their hands on recruits. In order to plug holes in their front lines, young men are not only being grabbed in the streets, in public transport in small cities. In fact, the draft officers are lying in wait for them at concerts and restaurants in Kiev, places where young men used to be able to go without fearing being snatched by the draft office, and then a few days later, after some perfunctory training, ending up on the front lines. The hunt for men is very harsh. It is not regulated by any laws. According to information that's made it online, in Ukraine, as part of the forced mobilization, over 100 men have died at the hands of these draft officer polizais. No one's been detained, no one's been punished, and the information about these incidents has been hushed up. And yet, still, there is not enough cannon fodder on the front. At the behest of Kiev's backers, increasingly we're hearing calls to lower the draft age to 18 to 21 years old. In this context, many are hiding at home, dodging the draft, fleeing the country. Online, there are many videos showing Ukrainian men who've managed to cross the border, congratulating themselves on fleeing what they call Zelensky's concentration camp. Quite a few of them opt to go to Russia. Between February of 2022 and 2023, in that period alone, 5.3 million Ukrainian refugees arrived in the Russian Federation. Now there are many more on our soil. And yet Zelensky and his posse are incensed that those who've moved to the West, that these Ukrainians, when they encounter everyday problems, humiliation, and discrimination based on the language they speak, not only decide to move to Russia, but they're actually moving to the very regions which joined our country following the referendums in the fall of 2022, and they're doing this en masse. Ukrainian men who haven't managed to flee, who are being sent to the front line forcibly, they've decided to surrender right away or to desert. According to the data from the Public Prosecutor's Office of the Ukraine, in the first 8 months of 2024, almost 30,000 cases were opened following incidents of soldiers going AWOL. Back in 2022, there were only 6,500 such cases. According to experts, in actual fact, the number of deserters runs into the hundreds of thousands, between 100,000 and 170,000. All of Ukraine is heatedly discussing what's happening, this free-for-all surrounding the mobilization process. And it is only Kiev's Western sponsors who are trying to turn a blind eye to this fatal trend, trying to convince the head of the Kiev regime to continue sending these poor souls to the front. Ukrainian soldiers who we've taken prisoner have said that in order to avoid demotivated Ukrainian recruits from fleeing right away, in the rear guard there are well-motivated nationalists and neo-Nazis who are basically anti-retreat forces, shooting them in the back if they try to flee. Another way of keeping up the fighting spirits in the Ukrainian army is pumping the army full of foreign mercenaries. Since we began the special military operation, at least 15,000 mercenaries from over 100 countries have arrived in Ukraine. Most of them have been liquidated, but private military companies from Poland and the US are trying to enlist more, trying to entice people to send their servicemen to Ukraine as cannon fodder. Specifically, the following private military companies are actively involved: Academy, Cubic, Dacos Benefits, Dean Corporation, Forward Observation Group, Hyperion Services, Sign of Liberty International, and the Polish private military companies ASBS Otago and European Security Academy. It is mercenaries and nationalists who stand behind the most notorious, the most chilling crimes and violations of international humanitarian law, including those committed by bandits and marauders when they invaded the Kursk region. We have incontrovertible evidence of the most serious crimes being committed by the Kiev regime vis-à-vis the civilians and civilian infrastructure in Russian cities. This is something we convincingly demonstrated at the Aria Formula meeting last week. The fact that Ukrainian soldiers shot at civilians in the Kursk region who were fleeing is something that even American journalists had to recognize just a few days ago. Madam President, without a doubt, none of the truth I've just told you will be repeated by Western colleagues today, just like we won't hear any comments from them regarding the countless violations by the Zelensky regime of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. They have been deliberately mining, Ukrainian units have been deliberately mining road shoulders, bridges, and territories surrounding residential buildings, hospitals, and educational institutions. They've been using the civilian population, mining them with anti-personnel mines called peto, other traps, and mining the bodies of fallen civilians and servicemen. For instance, just a few days ago, a video appeared online in which a Ukrainian army soldier is stuffing explosives into a child's toy, saying that this toy will be sent to the Kursk region. Its hackneyed narrative is repeated by the West, and that's easier than assessing the facts which show that the Ukrainian armed forces have been systematically using against the Russian armed forces and civilians toxic chemicals, which are scheduled in the Convention on Chemical Weapons, BZ, and chloropicrin as well. They've been using other agents, including right control agents. These facts are either hushed up or, as per the West's tradition, they're trying to accuse the Russian Federation of using these chemicals. On the 21st of October, the representative of Slovenia tried to lay the blame on Russia, the blame for using chemical substances, toxic substances, in the same river. He forgot that back on the 13th of September, in this very chamber, we warned against the potential release of toxic chemicals in the following rivers, the Seine and the Desna. And this could be done by a military-industrial complex company, Ukrainian one, in the Sumy region. Madam President, by way of conclusion, I recommend that our Western colleagues muster up their courage and recognize that the course they've chosen, fighting Russia using Ukrainian hands, is unjustified. The hopes of inflicting strategic defeat on our country and forecasts about the inevitable crash of our economy have not come to pass, no matter how much the UK representative tried to convince us of the opposite yesterday. The facts are very stubborn, and they show that the short-sighted policies pursued by Washington, London, and Brussels, the economic and energy crisis, have hit Western countries and their citizens the hardest, whereas the Russian Federation managed to withstand thousands of sanctions. Our economy is growing. Last year, it grew roughly 3.5%. This year, economic growth is estimated at 4%, 3.9%. And yet the Eurozone economy is teetering on the brink of recession. We've heard that Germany's biggest company, Volkswagen, plans to close at least 3 plants, to lay off tens of thousands of staff, and to enact a pay cut to the tune of 18% on the remainder of its staff. Siemens in the meantime, said that investing in Germany is pointless, and the company will now only invest in broadening its capacity abroad. Attempts to isolate our country were proven to be in vain last week, when last week, in fact, in Kazan, we held the BRICS summit, attended by leaders from 36 countries and 6 international organizations. They are the drivers of a process for finding just, sustainable, and lasting peace to the Ukrainian crisis, based on respect for the UN Charter in full, not just the bits about territorial integrity. They also call for the resolution of its root causes, coming up with lasting and equal security formula, which take into account the interests of all global players. This is a serious approach. It's not just some attempt to impose ultimatums on Russia, something that's divorced from reality. I'd like to warn you that we cannot have a repeat of the scenario with the Minsk agreement. We can't simply freeze the front so that the Zelensky regime can lick its wounds. Just like we won't have Ukraine in NATO in any form. Our special military operation aims at demilitarization and denazification in Ukraine. All of the objectives remain in force. They're unchanged. What is changing, and precipitously so, is the size of the territory under the control of the Kiev regime. I suggest those cheering on their Ukrainian sidekicks to remember this fact, and to think not about the Zelensky posse, but rather about the interests of the Ukrainian people. Their long-term interests lie in peace and good neighborly relations with the Russian Federation. So far, our Western colleagues aren't managing to do so very well. I thank you.